the Gemara that discusses this idea of starting out by giving someone who's sick, and you have to give them non-kosher food, or in our case, Yom Kippur, you start out by giving them lighter prohibitions, and then only increase in prohibition when we see that's necessary. There's a few more lines in that Gemara, and then we're going to get to chapter 617 of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the first of two chapters that we are going to be learning in the Shulchan Aruch from the Gemara we just learned. 617 is about pregnant women, and then 618, which is about sick person. But even 617 has some laws regarding to sick person as well, and we'll see all of that, God willing. So let's conclude our Gemara. We are on Pei Gimel Amud Beis, 83b, and we are 4 lines down from the bottom of the page. We're actually 3 lines down, but that whole line, it would seem, and they write this in the notes on the side, that doesn't really belong there because the Gemara's commentary afterwards doesn't refer to that, as Rashi tells us. Okay, so the Gemara says, Lema Tanoi, let us suggest that what we said earlier is subject to a debate, a dispute amongst the Mishnaic age scholars. Which issue? The question of 2 rabbinic prohibitions that are competing with each other, if you will. The first is, on Shabbos, one is not allowed to take Truma. Taking Truma on Shabbos, as we said before, is a rabbinic prohibition. And the Gemara here says it's tiltal, says it's an issue of muktzah. Even though as mentioned yesterday, there might be other issues as well, but here the Gemara says tiltal. That's one issue. Now I'll take Truma. The other issue here is that this produce is only responsible for Truma rabbinically, because it grew in a pot that did not have a hole in the bottom. So they didn't get direct nutrients from the land of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore its obligation to give Truma is not biblical. It's only rabbinic. So you have 2 rabbinic prohibitions. Which one should I violate in order to feed this sick person of this produce? Should I give it to him without taking Truma? And then he's in violation of the rabbinic commandment to take Truma on this kind of produce because it grew in a pot that didn't have a hole in the bottom. Or do I violate the rabbinic prohibition of taking Truma on Shabbos, take Truma, and that way the food he eats is kosher? And Rabbi said, better give him the kosher food after Truma is taken, even though it's a rabbinic prohibition to take Truma. And we suggested an explanation yesterday, right? But that was the statement. Now the Gemara is suggesting perhaps this question is subject to dispute between 2 sages of the Mishnaic era. Lema Tanoihi, let us say that this is a question that has been debated in the Mishnaic era. Tanya, we've learned in the Mishnaic age text in Ebraisa, someone who was bitten by a snake on Shabbos. So the assumption is that the venom is lethal. So you bring a doctor for this person from one location to another, even though ordinarily one cannot leave outside the city limits plus 2,000 cubits. But here in this case, if it need be, you got to run to the next town, call a doctor, and do so. Likewise, and you can literally rip, that's the literal language. But basically, you can kill a chicken on the spot. If he needed that to survive, apparently that was part of the remedies. The Goizin is tradition, and you can rip out leek from the earth, which is also apparently part of the remedy. I think one, if I'm not mistaken, one of them, the chicken is not to eat, but actually to put it onto the wound. And then the leek is to feed him. I remember one is for feeding and one is to put on the actual wound. This was the remedy back in the day. So you can do all of that stuff. And you give him to eat. And you don't have to waste time giving a tithe, which a leek requires tithe. These are the words of Rabbi. Okay, so Rabbi is of the view that you don't take tithe, even though in other words, you have to rip the chicken because that's what he needs. Okay, fine, no choice, no way of getting around that. You have to rip the leek out of the ground to feed him leek because that's what he needs, no way around that. But tithe, I have a way around that, just take tithe. Says Rabbi, no, don't violate Shabbos, because taking tithe is at least rabbinically mandated. At least rabbinically prohibited on Shabbos. And one might assume take the tithe so that the person eats at least kosher food. Says Rabbi, no, don't take the tithe because it's a violation of Shabbos. So what Rabbi says, and this would support the view of Rabbi mentioned before. Rabbi, these are the words of Rabbi, but Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon disputes. Sorry, Rabbi said, Rabbi's against Rabbi. Rabbi said you do take the tithe. That's correct, sorry. But Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo yochel achi aser. Don't give him the leek. You rip the leek out of the ground because you have no choice. You kill the chicken on the spot because you have no choice. You've been doctored from out of town, you have no choice. But here you have a choice. You can give meiser. And therefore violate the rabbinic prohibition of not getting meiser on Shabbos rather than having this guy eat food that isn't tithed. Tevel. And therefore, Nehemiah let us suggest that the Blazer, Rabbi Shimon, in this latter view, he, sorry? We are talking about tevel. Tevel is untithed food or food that hasn't been taken truma. Tevel means produce prior to giving its proper gifts. Doesn't necessarily mean specifically truma. Sorry? Here, give the meiser, as in give meiser to the Kohen and Levi, and then the food is no longer tevel. Not give to the person meiser. Sorry. Give the requisite meiser to where it's supposed to go, and then you can feed this person chulin, proper food. Sorry? Yes, if he needs to eat more, you give him the meiser. Here it's obviously talking about where he needs less. That was the case we talked about yesterday. So therefore, Nehemiah let us suggest that Rabbi Shimon, that this view follows the view of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi, who told us yesterday that with this pot that doesn't have a hole, and therefore the commandment to give meiser is only the rabbinic. Nonetheless, give the meiser. Violate the rabbinic prohibition of giving meiser on Shabbos, and that way the food you're giving to the sick person is proper food. Just like Rabbi Shimon, which said, don't give him the leek. Don't give this person bit by a snake the leek unless you give him the requisite meiser. And therefore, v'lo Rabbi, it would not follow Rabbi, who said, feed him, don't wait till you give meiser, just give him the food, give him the leek. Says the Gemara, no. Afila tema, we can even say Rabbi. We might even suggest that Rabbi would agree with Rabbi that in a case where you have a pot where there's produce that grew in it, and this produce came from that pot, and the pot doesn't have a hole in it, and therefore the commandment to give the truma and the meiser is only rabbinic. Nonetheless, Rabbi would agree that in that instance, you should give meiser. You should give truma, let's say. Same thing. Even though, at least for the context of this conversation, it's the same thing. Even though giving meiser on leek is also the rabbinic, and giving meiser on the produce of a pot that doesn't have a hole is also rabbinic. Nonetheless, in the case of the leek, Rabbi would say, don't give the meiser. Feed it to him without giving meiser. Don't violate that commandment on Shabbos. Whereas when it comes to the question of the produce that grew in a pot that doesn't have a hole, he would agree with Rabbah and say, you should give the meiser, rather than feed him food from which meiser has been taken. Following? Why? When does Rabbi say not to give the meiser of the leek? Hasam, in that instance. With respect to meiser of vegetables, which is what this is, because it's a leek, which is rabbinic. And there is no instance in which vegetation is ever liable for meiser biblically. But when it comes to giving meiser from grain, which is biblical, it just so happens to be that this pot isn't biblical. But meiser dagan, meiser of grain, is a biblical thing. Then even Rabbi would agree, give the meiser. Because if you're going to say, let him eat it without taking the meiser, because this meiser happens to be rabbinic, because the pot doesn't have a hole in it, the person watching or observing will not know the distinction, oh, this came from a pot that doesn't have a hole, and this came from a pot that doesn't have a hole. And therefore that's a rabbinic meiser, and that's biblical meiser. The visuals is grain. And everybody knows that grain is a biblical issue. And therefore, in that instance, Rabbi would say, give the meiser. So no one should confuse it and say, oh, on Shabbos you can skip the meiser to feed somebody. Even though it's biblical. That's correct, which is a bit different than the way we explained it yesterday. Right? Even though I can make the argument that yesterday we made a proper, I can make the argument that yesterday what we said is correct, but that logic couldn't hold up according to Rabbi, because then that would mean, then Rabbi would have to say, even leek, you need to give Meiser, according to the logic we said yesterday. The logic we said yesterday was to do one swell prohibition and then allow the rest to be okay. Then that logic also applies to leek, right? And therefore, the Gemara has to take the argument further and to make a distinction and say, well, I'll apply the argument to here because of the mistake, but I won't apply it to leek because I won't make the mistake by leek, because leek to begin with is rabbinic, right? So I could make the argument of a hybrid between the two, but I don't know that I have to because the Gemara doesn't say anything like that. Anyway. That's correct. Today you have grain. That's right. Yesterday is grain and grain versus. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. So that goes for the Gemara. Now let's get to the Shulchan Aruch related to that.